Note that the opposing team continuously uses the phrase using the cultures in order to promote. Like, we think this is an integral part of their case, and it actually speaks to the principal part of their argument and how it founds the case itself, because what they want is to use these cultures, as they've said, in order to promote not the indigenous culture, but to source revenue and promote large companies that don't benefit them. It promotes the government, which thus, again, in this post-colonial world, doesn't benefit them again. We don't see these indigenous communities actually benefiting from marketing of their culture, from stereotyping, from tokenism. We firmly oppose this. So 2 points for the House today. First, on if marketing of these indigenous cultures actually provides us a mechanism for degradation of the cultures of these indigenous people. Second, on which House actually is able to prove that these indigenous cultures can have the best economic outcomes in this debate. So first, on the culture part, we've heard a few mechanisms that were not really fleshed out in this debate, and their whole case is widely assertions, where first of all they tell us that these indigenous people are not even looked as normal citizens. Second of all, they said that indigenous people have more bargaining power. They also tell us at third that people want to engage with indigenous culture. Then fourth, they tell us symbol of change in America, they're going to follow what we've done in New Zealand, that these people are going to change, that other countries want to follow in our aspect where we somehow successfully marketed. And then fifth, they also touched on the aspect that there's intellectual property. They could sue them, that this way these indigenous communities are actually in control. So I'm going to respond to them. So first, on how indigenous groups don't actually become normal citizens when you market them. I mean, fundamentally, just look at the word marketing and promoting. You're not promoting them as normal citizens. You wouldn't just promote a normal thing. You promote something that is supposed to be special. But this is exactly what we don't want. What we don't want is companies and the government looking at these communities as a special community, as something that's otherly. We want to normalize this community and just market them in the same sense that you would any other citizens. Sure, you can have Māori people, perhaps some aspects of Māori culture in marketing, but you really shouldn't be just stereotyping them into huckers with their tongues out, into cooking food in volcanoes. This is strictly what we don't want, and it's actually just a mischaracterization of these cultures as a whole. Now, secondly, on how indigenous people have more bargaining power, well, they characterize these indigenous communities as completely poor, completely impoverished. They're so desperate, we're going to get more revenue. Okay, let's take that characterization. How does a poor indigenous community actually have bargaining power? What's going to happen, and what has happened, is these big companies, the government, they bully these indigenous communities and these communities that hold small shops and whatnot into having a large proprietary or royalty fees on every product that they sell because they're being marketed on. They're completely taken advantage of. There is no bargaining power if you want to characterize them as poor and impoverished. They are going to be taken complete control of and advantage of, because they don't have anything to bargain with. They don't have leveraging power, as the opposing team has characterized in today's debate. Now, third, on why people want to engage more in this indigenous culture. Sure, they might want to, but the fact is they're not actually engaging with true indigenous culture. What they are engaging with is some Eurocentric view on what Māori, on what on what American Indians are. This is a complete mischaracterization, and this is not what we want people engaging with. What they're engaging with is 1960s cartoons, and not what these indigenous cultures actually look like. If we actually had these indigenous communities promote themselves in the way that they completely choose, outside of a third party with no help from the others, we would see a true representation of what their culture actually looks like, where there's no Western influence on them. Why can't we have this world where they are the sole proprietor, where they make the most money, where they have true cultural appropriation? This is what we want to have. Now, fifth, on how we're going to somehow be a symbol of change if we somehow properly market these indigenous cultures. Well, let's actually just look at the status quo. We haven't been able to do this at all. They say that New Zealand is a great example of it, where really it's not. Where indigenous cultures are still, like the Māori, extremely impoverished due to living in a post-colonial world where they don't actually get as much help as they should be from subsidies, from like more education, from more food. These things aren't even being provided to them, and the marketing itself, the tourism, hasn't actually gone back to benefit them like they said it would. Nothing has benefited them, but the only thing that's happened is the companies get richer and richer, and they keep taking advantage of Māori culture, of indigenous people. We also see on other countries such as America, this hasn't been a symbol of change. Where have we seen indigenous people in America actually being promoted in a positive way, where they get 100% say in how their culture is actually identified as? Like, they don't actually get these. The opposing team doesn't know what they're talking about. Now let's look at the intellectual property and suing. Now this brings back and ties back to the second thing we talked about, where they don't actually have bargaining power as well. It's the same concept. They're too poor, like you've characterized yourself. They don't have this bargaining power. They won't be able to do this. Now, like, if we weigh up the points, all they've been able to do is provide like a semi-mechanized point on how the culture will be somewhat like engaged with by foreigners, by like the people there. But first of all, we've already told you that this culture is not actually a true representation of their culture. They're engaging with a delusion. And second of all, we told you, even if they are, this is still not good for them because they're not profiting. And if we did it on our counterfactual, where they have true cultural appropriation, where the indigenous people get to control their indigenous culture, this is what's best. The opposing team hasn't been able to prove that there will be some cultural revelation. Now let's look at the second point of clash on like economic benefits. Now the opposing team has done three things in today's debate about this. First of all, they've told us about like Rotorua and the Māori village, how there's going to be higher revenue somehow. They second of all told us that it's going to go back into funding meals, into like helping poverty. And third, they told us that these communities, and they characterized it as completely impoverished. Like, let's look at this completely. Fundamentally, what you're having is large companies leeching off these indigenous cultures, where they market them as whatever they like, with Māori sticking their tongues out completely naked so that this attracts tourists. This is not what we want on a principal point. But second of all, these indigenous cultures and these communities aren't benefiting from this at all. First of all, if we look at it directly, they're not getting money, because even if they are getting revenue, it's being heavily taxed on by the government. And second of all, they have to pay a cut to these large companies. They're already losing out on so much revenue. Second of all, even if this money goes back to the government, they don't actually benefit from them. They don't even get subsidized back on. They don't get better education. They get none of these things. At the end of the day, it's just an impoverished community, as they've characterized, which doesn't get money back from being promoted as like some sort of tourist. They don't get cultural appropriation. They don't have anything. All they get is a stereotype about how their culture is supposed to look like in a Western eye. Thank you.